All right, good morning, everybody. Our text is Luke 15, verses 17 through 24. Luke 15, verses 17 through 24. Let's begin by reading it. But when he came to his senses, that's a younger son in this story, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men.' So he got up and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.' And they began to celebrate." This morning we continue our study of Luke chapter 15. Whose theme, as we've noted, is the father's joy over the recovery of his lost children. A motif illustrated by Jesus in this chapter in three parables. The story of a lost sheep, a lost coin, and then a lost son, or maybe we want to say sons in the plural. And I wonder, when we form an image of the Almighty in our minds, when we think about God, is that picture consistent with the one that's depicted here in these stories? A God who is filled with joy, who is exceedingly jubilant. As Protestants, we tend to prioritize the forensic nature of God's love and holiness, his kindness and severity, is how the Hebrew writer puts it, and how that twin nature is turned against itself in the death of Adam, and is then reconciled in the death of his faithful descendant, the true and better Adam, or the true and better man, Jesus. And of course, there's good reason to emphasize this forensic nature in God, because it is the hinge upon which the gate of the gospel turns. But if you add to this the fact that we are living in the shadow of modernity, which was a time when emotions were often viewed with great suspicion, even as an enemy of reason and revelation itself, a period that's sort of a time of cold rationalism that I'm actually afraid we're headed back to as sort of a defense mechanism against a growing group of people who are unable to govern their own emotions, and so they want to govern everyone else, it seems, which is your only option if you don't want to govern yourself. And so I'm afraid that as a defense mechanism, we might be going back into this kind of cold rationalism. But given the fact that we are Protestants, and that we are so significantly influenced by modernity, I think it's hard for us to get beyond the legal metaphors concerning God and see that the impartial judge of all the earth is also someone who loves to throw extravagant dinner parties. Someone who longs to lavish expensive gifts upon his beloved, whose joy at times is so exuberant that he must share it with all the host of heaven. Because this is exactly how God is depicted in this chapter. A rejoicing shepherd who has recovered his lost sheep, an elated woman who has found her favorite coin, and a doting father who has received back his defiled son. Three stories, notice, each of which terminate in immoderate feasting, in abundant feasting. Now, Jesus' original audience, the scribes and Pharisees, also had difficulty accepting the opulent nature of the Father's joy. To them, such lofty rejoicing was at best a bit over the top. Throwing a party for one sheep seems a bit much. And at worst, it was shamefully intemperate. The killing of the fattened calf for an ignominious child was a shocking act of malfeasance, a shameful wasting of precious, even sacred resources. Forget the prodigal son. For pious elites, this seemed to be the story of the prodigal father, a nobleman who wastes his jubilance on a son who deserves his contempt. These religious referees, if you will, were ready to blow the parable dead upon the son's return and assess a 5-yard penalty to the father for excessive celebration. It is a Super Bowl, so I thought I would make my sermon relevant with that analogy. The question I wish to explore in the remainder of this series, which is 62 parts, I'm just kidding, it's only one more, is the question I want to explore something like this. How are we to make sense of such reckless merrymaking? How can a nobleman rightfully rejoice in the face of such ignobility? What about his sense of propriety, in other words? What about his sense of duty? What about his sense of fairness, his sense of shame? In order to understand the Father's actions, we have to spend a little more time immersing ourselves in the cultural context of the third parable, which includes understanding the expectations of how this nobleman should have responded to his son's return. Now, as I said last week, the parable opens with the younger son cast in the role of the villain. The first words out of his mouth are, "Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me." An impudent request, which is equivalent to saying, "I wish you were dead so that I could just take my inheritance and leave." Now, last time I mentioned how this statement, this shocking statement, serves as a catalyst to the story. It gets the story going. But what I forgot to mention is that the opening line of this parable, "A man had 2 sons," is actually a storyteller's trope in Jewish literature. And what it would have immediately brought into the minds of the audience is Cain and Abel, and Ishmael and Isaac, and Esau and Jacob. In other words, the expectation when Jesus begins this parable is to think that the younger son is going to be the one who is righteous and who is faithful and even maybe just clever or cunning. But Jesus confounds the listener's expectations by making the younger son into a fool, making him into someone who is indulgent. So that peripeteia we talked about last time, this constant spinning of the story in a different direction, the reversal of expectations of your audience, happens from the very beginning. Jesus sets them up and then he knocks them down. He spins the story in a completely different direction. All that to say that this is masterful storytelling. Now, this blatant insubordination, as we said last time, represented an extraordinary privation of gratitude and appreciation, not just for the father's provision, but for the life-giving resources it took generations of his family to acquire. And so to exhaust these precious resources upon oneself would be considered the very worst kind of infidelity, a duty which is utterly lost, it seems, on the younger son. For he wants nothing to do with his family or his community or even his religion. His duty is to himself alone. What this young man wants, as we explored last time, is autonomy in the absolute sense. He wants a freedom from all restrictions, a prize that he's willing to squander not only his family's fortune for, but his entire national inheritance. And it's a pursuit of freedom that ends in absolute tyranny. Now, such a brazen request would be viewed by the father as an act of rank rebellion, of course. And the expectation was that it would be met with a slap across the face, a common Jewish gesture of rebuke. In fact, what it merited in Jewish culture was a beating. And this would be followed then by public humiliation, and perhaps even a dispossession of the son's inheritance. This is how bad a breach of conduct this was. It could end in excommunication from the family and even the community. And if that were to take place, it was customary to hold an official ceremony, publicly declaring the son's expulsion from the community. A funeral, if you will, for the son who was now dead to everyone. This is why in verse 24, when the son returns, the father says, "This son of mine was dead." And later he says the exact same thing to the elder brother. Such insolence, in other words, came at a heavy price. But rather than rebuke his son, and here's the next twist in the story, that which spins it in a different direction, the father simply grants his request. And it's at this point in the story, this point in the parable, that the scribes and Pharisees would begin to question the nobleman's character. And I think modern audiences do as well. A suspicion accompanied perhaps by an epiphany as to why the son acts the way that he does. Right? The reason he behaves as he does is because his father has withheld discipline from him. And now the son has brought shame upon his father as a consequence. The father has indulged the son, and the son has now become indulgent. He's kept the rod from the boy, and he's ruined him. Now it's interesting, one of the things interesting about this is it's somewhat similar, and I'm not saying it's a one-to-one similarity, but it's kind of like when your toddler throws an all-out tantrum in the grocery store, what's taking place here in the minds of the Pharisees, I think. Your toddler throws an absolute fit, and then everyone, of course, looks at you to see how you're going to react to it. All of a sudden the spotlight is on you, you're on stage, and now everybody wants to know what you're going to do. And among certain Christian parents, there is a set expectation for what that response is to be, right? An accepted method of discipline, a sort of one-size-fits-all approach that if you don't adhere to it in that moment, results in a loss of esteem, in judgment being cast upon you. Which is to say that there is a pressure to respond to such a situation in a particular way, regardless of what the context is, regardless of what has happened before or might be happening after. And what's interesting about this, or one of the things interesting about this text, is that the father, who again is God in the story, resists that pressure. And he defies that expectation. And I don't think we know why he does. We can speculate as to why. But the fact that he does should tell us, at the very least, that context matters when disciplining a child. Something that experience should teach us. Context which includes the very personality of the child themselves. Therefore, we should be leery, I think, of one-size-fits-all approaches. One form of discipline that fits every scenario and every child. And then we should also be careful not to judge the disciplinary methods of our brothers and sisters when we are ignorant of the entire context. One of the things we learn from this parable, one of the things it points to, is the self-righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, who were inclined toward these kinds of judgments. And the reason why is because others were the standard by which they would judge themselves. And the solution to that kind of Pharisaism is, of course, not, having no judgment at all. That's not the solution. But rather to have righteous judgment, which requires being slow to judgment. But not only does the younger son demand the inheritance, he squanders it in loose living, as we documented in some detail last week, throwing away generations of sacrifice in the most shameful kind of behavior that a Jew could imagine, the consequences of which was a total loss of dignity, honor, and shame. To his fellow Jews, especially those who were pious, he was to them as an unclean animal. So the question now is, given the son's repentance, can he be restored? Can he be forgiven? To a Christian audience, we're like, yes, absolutely, move on. But to the original audience of this parable, forgiveness is anything but a foregone conclusion. For even if it were possible to forgive the son, most fathers, I don't think, would want their sons back. Better for him to be dead than defiled like this. So the only chance at restoration the Son has is to appeal to the Father's mercy. He must come to the Father, confess all of his transgressions, humble himself before him, subjecting himself to public scorn and humiliation, and then, if accepted, make restitution. In other words, much would have been required of him in order to be let back in. And what I want to say is, rightfully so. His transgressions were that villainous. In traditional cultures, and this is hard for us to relate to, being in a modern culture, perhaps the first modern culture ever, the kind of culture we have now. But in traditional cultures, it was essential to protect the honor of the father. For the survival of the family depended upon that taking place. And the same is true for protecting the honor of a nobleman in a community, because the survival of the community was dependent upon it. Because when the nobleman and the father is dishonored, the entire family and community is dishonored. And they are in danger of losing everything. Most importantly, they're in danger of losing their honor, but they were also in danger of losing their right standing before God. In this culture, the shame of sin, in other words, was shared among the community in some sense. We've discussed this a little bit before, and I used the word imputed, although not in the strict theological sense. But in some sense, the guilt of the Son is imputed to the community. It's imputed to the group. And the only way to expiate that guilt, the only way to avoid the shame and possible divine retribution, was to punish the wrongdoer, even in a public way. He had stained the community, and the only way to remove that stain was for him to be held accountable, which is right. And what it does is it lets everyone know, including God, that this community does not condone his evil deeds. I don't know if you've ever noticed this before, but you see it time and again in the Old Testament. When God holds kings accountable for their tyrannous actions, it's not that he just lets the subjects off the hook, right? He also holds the subjects of these kings accountable for not resisting these tyrants. It's not that the citizens, the subjects can say, well, the king's gone off the deep end, he's engaging in all of this immoral behavior, he's acting as if he is God, we're just going to put our head down and hide and wait till it's over, there's nothing we can do about it. That's not how God deals with it in the Old Testament. He holds the subjects accountable for not holding the kings accountable. And it seems to me that there's a principle that's taught there, being taught. And that we can apply a principle also to communities and to families. In fact, I think this is exactly what we see later in the story when the elder brother refuses to go into the party that's being thrown. He is trying to hold his father accountable for what he thinks is egregious behavior. Now, in one sense, this kind of shared shame and shared guilt is very foreign to us. In fact, in many ways, we are a shameless culture, where we relentlessly strive to remove the stigma of sin wherever we find it. This is what psychotherapist Joseph Burgo calls the anti-shame zeitgeist, where shame is viewed as an enemy that is to be resisted in order to maintain psychological well-being. This is also true of guilt. And this is why, as we've discussed, why college campuses create safe spaces to protect their fragile undergraduates from emotionally triggering ideas. These spaces are judgment-free zones that are there to protect full self-expression, which is, sort of the ultimate ethic. Unless, of course, the expression includes the tenets of Orthodox Christianity, which at that point would be harshly judged if you were to express them. But at least on the surface, they're saying what we want to do is free this person from any kind of judgment whatsoever. So in one sense, shame has become a taboo in our culture. But something we've also talked about a lot is that there is a new religion that is emerging, which has rediscovered the utility of shame. A cancel culture which thrives, in fact, on its power. where the purpose of such shaming is punitive only and consumed by justice to the neglect of mercy. It's not social, it's social justice, right? It's not social mercy that they promote. Which, by the way, Martin Luther King's idea of justice was tempered significantly by mercy. But again, the problem is not shame per se or guilt per se, because both shame and guilt are just consequences for unrighteous behavior. And they are also necessary to bring about real repentance, real spiritual formation. And the same is true with the rightness of restitution. The wrongdoer must restore the one that he has wronged. This is part of the fruit of repentance. Now, we may find the shaming methods of traditional cultures to be off-putting with our modern sensibilities. And no doubt there have been extreme examples of it where people are dehumanized, examples we should condemn. But I think that a lot of this is just subjective. Approaches to shame in one culture are going to be completely ineffective in another. And so the problem with the scribes and Pharisees and their postmodern counterparts is not that they promote the concepts of guilt and shame, but rather that they do so to the neglect of mercy. It is a justice untempered by mercy. But this was not the case with the father in our story, and his son knows it. And so the only hope the son has at restoration is to appeal to his father's mercy, to beg his father to allow him to return as a hired hand, is what he says, and to work off his debt. So he's begging to be what is essentially a day laborer, who's not really a member of the family at all, not even a house slave. There's no commitment to a day laborer other than just, for that day's labor, and after that they can get rid of him. But here's the thing, to let him back in, even in this limited capacity, make no mistake, would be an act of sheer mercy on the part of the father. For he does not owe the son a chance at restitution, not from the standpoint of strict justice anyway. Which is to say that mercy may be a duty of a Jewish nobleman, a righteous Jewish nobleman. Part of his duty might be mercy. But that doesn't make it a right of the son to receive that mercy. One of the great tragedies of our society is that we've lost that distinction between duties and rights. We think that they're the same thing. But as I said, the father doesn't owe the son this kind of restitution. What the son has earned is the opposite. We might say destitution, not restitution. Now, if the father were to choose mercy, what would that look like at this time? Well, some scholars have suggested the following scenario. Upon the son's return, the father initially would ignore his request for a meeting. And so the son would be left outside the gate for days even, in full view of the public. And this allowed the citizens to express their disappointment and outrage at his misdeeds. And mocking and spitting upon him would not have been out of the question. And the son would expect it, and he would understand it, and he believed he deserved it. For such actions represented in this culture a righteous expression of anger. Again, what he did affected the entire community. It was dangerous for everyone. And these people were angry about it, righteously angry. Now again, I know this offends our late modern sensibilities because we're told time and again that shame should never be a form of discipline, regardless of the context. It seems to be one of our culture's categorical imperatives. It is wrong always and everywhere to shame someone. Ask any counselor who's breathed in the spirit of the age, and they will tell you in no uncertain terms how wrong it is. Although not wrong enough, it seems, to offend their consciences when they join the rabble to stone a blaspheming white supremacist, or hold the coats of those who do. But on the surface, they will make the claim that shaming is unproductive at best and absolutely evil at worst. The point is, the son knew what was coming, and he was ready to sit there and to take it. And then after a certain period of time, the father would call him in order to discuss restitution. The reception would be quite cool, and the son would be required to bow down and kiss the father's feet. Another thing we gag on is modern people. And then they would discuss the necessary reparations, the paying back of the estate, which in this case, by the way, he could never do. What was gained over generations could not be made up for by working 100 lifetimes as a hired hand. He will never be able to pay this debt back, ever. And so full restitution is never going to come. The past could never be fully atoned for in this case. He would forever be, until his dying day, the prodigal son. But that wasn't acceptable to his father. While the returning son was still a long way off, the text says, meaning that he hasn't even reached the gate of the village yet, and his father sees him. Which seems to suggest that his father has been looking for him, likely every day, hoping and praying that he would see the familiar walk of his son coming down the path. A scene he has likely played over and over again in his mind. But now it has become a reality. And the father feels compassion for his son, Jesus says. Not just compassion for his present state of fallenness, but compassion for what was about to happen to him, what he was about to experience. Notice that this is taking place in the day, in daytime, which means that the village is likely bustling with activity. Women and children and older folks, everyone essentially who's not out in the field working, is around, moving around, doing various things, including all of the nobleman's servants. It's a lot of busy activity during the day in the village. Which means that there may be a second reason why the father is so eager to spot his child. Namely, that if the son returns, the father wants to reach the boy before he reaches the village. Now, why would he want to do that? Well, it seems that the father is not only ready to receive back his son, but he also wants to protect him from the ridicule and scorn that he is about to experience. And the only way to do that is to take the shame upon himself. We might say to take the punishment in his place. And so what does he do? He runs to his son while he's still afar off. Now here's the thing. Middle Eastern noblemen don't run. They don't run now. They didn't run then. That's just a fact. Scholar Kenneth Bailey, who's an expert in the Middle East, has written about this subject of why Middle Eastern noblemen don't run, including the following paragraph. One of the main reasons why Middle Easterners of rank do not run is that traditionally they all have worn long robes. This is true of both men and women. No one can run in a long robe without taking it up into his or her hands. When this occurs, the legs are exposed, which is considered humiliating. The robes themselves reach to the ground to make sure this didn't happen. A quaint ruling for the Sabbath states that if a bird crawls under your robes on the Sabbath, you may not catch it, because you might have to expose your leg to do that. So it says, quote, the suggested alternative is to sit very quietly and wait for sundown so no one can see, and then seize the bird. In fact, this is so much a part of Middle Eastern culture that in some Arabic versions of the New Testament, there is just an utter unwillingness to translate the running into the text. In their minds, the father just wouldn't do it. It was that humiliating, especially for a nobleman who represents God. God would never humiliate himself in this way. So why is the father running? What is he running for? Why does he expose himself to this shame and ridicule? The reason the Father runs, heaping scorn upon himself, is in order to prevent his Son from receiving the ridicule. It's in order to shield his Son by taking it upon himself. And it doesn't end with the running. For upon reaching his Son, he falls on his neck, fully embracing him, kissing him with reckless abandon. The Son, who probably still smells like pigs, he fully embraces him. All of these are cultural signs of intimate fellowship. And then he announces for everyone to hear, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate." So the Father declares for all to hear that the Son has been returned to sonship. And he's going to throw the most extravagant feast possible. The fattened calf was to be reserved for the most grandiose of occasions, which, all of which tells us that when it comes to the reconciliation of sinners, mercy isn't good enough for our Father. He wants our sonship to be fully reinstated. He wants our past convictions to be expunged from our record. Not only does he want our debt to be zeroed out, he wants to give us a full inheritance. And if that means that he must become poor in order to accomplish it, so be it. If that means that he must be humiliated so that we can be exalted, not my will, but thine be done, is what he says. If it means that he must die so that we might live, he will endure it for the joy that is set before him. So this, again, is the picture of salvation that Jesus is painting for the scribes and Pharisees. This reckless response of God to the mere repentance of one sinner. This is the prodigal God, the wasteful God. A Father who casts aside duty and propriety and fairness, all in order to embrace his defiled Son. And yet, if our love could be set free from the shackles of fairness and propriety, I wonder what we could accomplish in this world. Or that we could take upon ourselves the shame of others so that they might be spared of it. But this is in part the idea of what's behind the cross, right? Jesus bearing the humiliation that is due us for our sins. A Roman cross was about humiliation, more perhaps than anything else, even more than the physical torture of it. It was a bloody spectacle to show, this is what happens if you engage in rebellion. We utterly humiliate you. The extravagance that we read about in this story, I think, teaches us two things. The extravagance of the Father. Two things in the context of this story. The first is a lesson from the point of view of the younger son. In the beginning of our story, the younger boy doesn't think that his father knows anything about freedom. Obliged to steward the family's legacy, the father is a slave to the past and the future, inundated with restrictions and responsibilities. In other words, his relationships have enslaved him. Love has enslaved him. Indeed, love for his unlovable child costs him everything that he should hold dear. And so the younger son rebels against this, and he seeks liberation in the present, a journey which, as we said, ends in tyranny. For it is because of the father's grounding in the past and his confidence in the future that he is free to risk the present for a higher level of being. He's free to risk the present for love. Which is to say that self-love and genuine love appear to be at odds with each other. It seems as if egoism and altruism are opposing orientations, as one philosopher puts it. I mean, certainly Ayn Rand thought this was the case. You can't love yourself and love someone else, right? You can't pursue your own happiness and pursue the happiness of someone else. And so, In Rand's mind, you're a fool if you don't prioritize your own happiness. But the truth is, when self-love grows into genuine love, this opposition is overcome. Which is to say that love begins with self-love, right? Or a selfish love, we might want to say. Meaning that the reason for wanting to be with one's beloved in the beginning is because of one's own happiness. You're pursuing your happiness. You have great affection for this person, and that's why you want to be with them. But as love grows, and one really begins to care for the other person, true happiness begins to be found in seeking the happiness of the other person. In this relation, self-love, in the words of Søren Kierkegaard, founders but is not annihilated, meaning that self-love in time isn't annihilated by genuine love, but it gets absorbed into it. Or as another writer puts it, self-love fulfills its goal of personal happiness by relinquishing it, by ceasing to make egotistic satisfaction its primary end. Which is to say that if you pursue freedom or love or happiness for yourself, here's the paradox, you will never find it. If you pursue freedom for yourself, it ends in tyranny, like the younger son. If you pursue love for yourself, it ends in apathy. If you pursue happiness for yourself, it ends in despair. But if you pursue it for others, not only will you obtain it, but you will never lose it. This is what Jesus means when he says, "For he who finds his life will lose it, but he who loses his life will find it." The second lesson to be learned from God's extravagant love in this story concerns the notion of duty. The father's apparent setting aside of duty. How are we to make sense of God setting aside the notion of duty? And again, the answer is going to be there's an absorption that's taking place of what true duty is. But this is the topic we'll discuss next week when we focus upon the elder brother.